Ghost Story, The Haunting. Author, Trung Kian. My cousin, let's call him Mr. T, was born in 1981. He now has a wife and 2 children, one in 5th grade and the younger in 2nd grade. His family used to live in a market stall, but when the district market closed down, Mr. T and his wife, Miss L, bought land and built a house in a small hamlet near where... Let me tell you about this hamlet. It's called Freedom Hamlet. It used to be sparsely populated and bordered the fields where graves were scattered randomly along the village paths and alleys. The plot of land Mr. T bought is in a bend in the road at the entrance of a small alley. At the beginning of this alley lies a tiny, neglected grave hidden under the bushes. No one knows whose grave it is or which family the deceased belonged to. All that was known was that the grave was already there when Mr. T's family moved in. When neighbors were asked about it, they shrugged and said it had been there for a long time, and no one knew whose it was. Graves like this, unidentified and scattered along the roadsides, were not uncommon in Freedom Hamlet. It was about 20 meters from Mr. T's house gate, quite close indeed. To get out onto the main road of the hamlet from his gate, Mr. T had to pass by this grave and the clump of bushes every day. Initially, when Mr. T first moved into the house, some neighbors warned him and his wife that there were strange things associated with that grave. Occasionally, on moonlit nights, people claimed to see someone sitting on top of the grave. Mr. T dismissed these stories with a laugh, thinking they were just idle gossip and superstition. After all, he had never believed in the supernatural world and had never encountered ghosts in his life. He was quite fearless about such matters, more concerned with his daily making ends meet than with ghostly tales. Then one evening, it was around 7 o'clock in the winter evening. After finishing their sales at the market, Mr. T's wife, Miss L, had gone home early to take care of their children and prepare dinner. Mr. T stayed behind to pack up his goods and attract a few more customers, hoping for some additional income. By the time he finished, it was already pitch dark. Winter evenings turn dark quickly. By 7 o'clock, it's hard to see clearly. Mr. T rode his bike home, feeling content because he had made a good profit that day. He imagined the hot meal waiting for him and his 2 children eagerly anticipating his return in the middle of their modest home. These simple pleasures in life were enough. As he pedaled towards home, lost in these thoughts, he turned into the alley leading to his house gate. Suddenly, his eyes swept across the dense clump of bushes near the small, ownerless grave that he passed by every day, just a few steps away from where he was cycling. In an instant, fleeting and swift from darkness to light, Mr. T's eyes skimmed over before he turned towards his house, catching a sudden sight that made him abruptly halt his bicycle. A figure, a blurry figure, under the white moonlight, stood silently beside the small grave beneath the clump of bamboo. Mr. T suddenly felt strange, a shiver running down his spine. Why would someone be standing there at this hour? Wasn't that where the deserted grave was located? Mr. T hit the brakes, coming to a sudden stop, now just about 15 meters from his house gate. The rustling sound of the bamboo behind him echoed softly, accompanied by the leaves rustling and rolling on the ground, sending a chill through Mr. T's entire body. Then, involuntarily, "Hey there." Mr. T jerked in surprise. It was a woman's voice. In the midst of the darkening sky at this eerie hour, someone called his name. Reflexively, Mr. T turned his head back and responded, "Huh?" But there was no one there. Behind him, a desolate scene of dark. Old bamboo bushes swayed gently. Below them lay the small, unclaimed grave, hidden in the shadows of the night. Mr. T muttered under his breath, "Weird." There was definitely someone standing there. Mr. T nervously scanned his surroundings. It was pitch dark, barely discernible except for the faint, pale light of the old, weather-beaten grave under the moonlight. He shook his head. Could he have been mistaken or heard wrong? He spoke aloud, "Who's there?" No answer came. The village alley was deserted and dark. At this hour, everyone was likely indoors, It was too cold for anyone to be out here. Mr. T glanced around for a while, waiting, but no one appeared. Perhaps he was just tired from the day's work and imagined it all. He turned his head back, shook his perplexed head, and swiftly rode into his courtyard. Behind him, the rustling sound of bamboo continued intermittently. Rustle, rustle. When Mr. T arrived home, Mrs. L was in the kitchen, and their 2 young children were watching TV. Mr. T announced his presence, and the kids, engrossed in their cartoon, joyfully ran towards him, shouting in excitement. Seeing her husband return, Mrs. L carried the hot dishes to the table on the roof, asking as she went, "Did you sell anything extra? Why are you back so late?" Mr. T rubbed his children's heads, intending to boast about his extra sales, when suddenly he remembered the strange encounter earlier. Before replying, "Oh, well, you see, as I was turning into the alley earlier, I thought I saw someone standing at the bend. I even heard someone call out to me, but when I turned back, there was no one there. Strange, right?" Mrs. L widened her eyes, teasingly scolding him. "Oh, come on now. Don't start with ghost stories like those old ladies in the neighborhood. Hurry up, go wash up, and come upstairs for dinner before it gets late." After Mrs. L finished speaking, she carried the dinner upstairs. Although Mr. T was still thinking about the strange incident, he dismissed it, thinking he must have imagined it. That evening passed swiftly, and before he knew it, it was already 10 p.m. During dinner, Mr. T had drunk a whole glass of his favorite 3-spiced wine, a gift from his father-in-law, which he cherished dearly. After finishing the glass, Mrs. L didn't seem too pleased with him, which was unusual. Mr. T watched soccer until past 11 p.m. before turning off the TV and heading downstairs to brush his teeth and shower before bed. He still felt a bit lightheaded from the wine. By this time, Mrs. L and their children had already gone to bed in their room. While brushing his teeth, Mr. T suddenly heard footsteps lightly pacing outside, behind the bathroom wall. The bathroom wall faced the outside alley. Since it was just a narrow alley separated by a wall, any footsteps outside could be easily heard. Moreover, it was nighttime, making the sound more distinct. The footsteps rustled as they walked, stepping on the edge of the grass and crunching on dry leaves. Mr. T furrowed his brow. It seemed like the footsteps were heading towards the gate of his house. Mr. T thought to himself, maybe someone in the alley is returning home late at night. After thinking for a moment, Mr. T shrugged off his concerns and continued brushing his teeth. Once finished, he turned off the lights and walked through the dark courtyard to ascend to the roof. That night was eerie, with pitch-black skies, the only sounds being insects chirping loudly and a dense mist enveloping, casting an obscure and surreal atmosphere. Suddenly, creak! The sound of the iron gate at Mr. T's house faintly echoed as if something had brushed against it. Mr. T paused mid-step on his way upstairs, turning to glance back. Before him, amidst the darkness, appeared the figure of a woman. It was a woman whose face was indistinct, dressed in a white owl dye, standing subtly outside Mr. T's gate. Her features were obscured by the thick mist, her long hair draped over most of her face, revealing only a tall and slender figure. The mysterious woman stood silently, making no utterance or movement. Mr. T was taken aback. In that moment facing the woman, Mr. T froze like a statue. Why was the gate in the middle of the night? She looked unfamiliar, someone he had never seen before in their small neighborhood alley. He finally spoke up. "Who's there?" The woman remained silent, motionless, no reaction whatsoever, standing as still as a statue. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew from outside the gate. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked sharply. Bark, bark, bark! Mr. T, staring at the woman, flinched slightly at the sound of the dog barking. He widened his eyes, trying to peer outside to see who it was. He cautiously stepped towards the gate. Just as he took a couple of steps, the woman abruptly turned and disappeared behind the corner of the wall, her figure vanishing quickly. She moved so silently, her footsteps barely making a sound, almost the ground. Mr. T was bewildered. He stepped quickly to the gate, poking his head out onto the alley, trying to follow the woman's shadow. But there was no one there, only a dark and empty alley stretched out before him. The only sounds were distant dog barks echoing through the long night. Far in the distance, the abandoned tombstone still lay silently in place. Mr. T suddenly felt a chill down his spine. He thought to himself, "How strange. What was that all about? Where did she go?" He glanced around for a while, seeing no one. The alcohol from earlier still made him feel a bit dizzy. He rubbed his head, thinking that perhaps the image he saw was just a result of the wine. He had already encountered a strange situation on how he unexpectedly saw the shadow of someone else. Was it because he was too busy with his sales lately, feeling exhausted and overthinking things? Mr. T furrowed his brow, pondering for a moment, then turned back and closed the gate behind him, leaving behind a backdrop of dark, chilling night that continued to envelop the cold, dark space. Mr. T entered the bedroom where Mrs. L and their 2 children were already fast asleep. Exhausted from a long day of hustling at the market to earn a living, he lay down wearily on the bed. His mind couldn't help but dwell on the recent incident. The girl had clearly away from him. How come she disappeared in an instant? Could it really be a ghost? Mr. T chuckled to himself. Ghosts? What nonsense. There's no such thing as ghosts in this world. It must have been his exhaustion playing tricks on him. He pulled the blanket up to his chest and nestled beside his wife, drifting off to sleep unaware of the time. That night, time passed heavily and eerily quiet. The couple's small, ramshackle house seemed engulfed in the thick, dark night of winter. The atmosphere was silent, devoid of any lights or sounds, except for occasional distant barks of dogs echoing intermittently. Mr. T was deeply immersed in a sound sleep when suddenly, outside the gate of his house, creak. Strange sounds echoed through the dark night as if someone was fiddling with the gate lock. Creak, creak. Mr. T opened his eyes, squinting as he looked up at the dimly lit ceiling. It seemed he had been asleep for quite some time. It must have been around 2 a.m. now. Beside him, Mrs. L and their 2 children were still sound asleep, wrapped snugly in their blankets. Mr. T sat up, listening intently. The strange noises outside the courtyard continued to resonate slowly and steadily. Creak, creak. Mr. T muttered to himself, "Darn it, sounds like a thief." In this neighborhood, theft was not uncommon due to the constant influx of people from all directions settling down. Incidents of missing dogs, chickens, and belongings were fairly frequent. He got out of bed, fumbling around to find a flashlight on the table, but it was nowhere to be found. He tiptoed quietly, carefully stepping out into the main room, squinting his eyes as he peered through the crack of the door. Outside, the courtyard was dark and chilly. It would have seemed quite normal and nothing out of the ordinary if right now, in front of Mr. T, the house lock wasn't rattling and swinging back and forth, banging against the iron gate, echoing with chilling creak, creak, creak sounds. Mr. T widened his eyes. He truly didn't understand what was happening anymore. The lock kept swinging, banging, occasionally scraping up and down, touching the iron gate in a continuous, unsettling rhythm, as if someone was desperately trying. Mr. T took a deep breath. He tried to widen his eyes as much as possible, looking through the dense fog to see what exactly was happening outside his gate. A shadowy figure, blurry under the moonlight, was standing outside the gate, fiddling with the lock of Mr. T's house. The frail, slender arms, fair and small, were gripping the lock and toying with it. It was her, exactly her. The girl in the white silk dress, her face obscured. She stood alone outside, silently staring at Mr. T while her arms gently rattled the gate lock. Creak, creak. Mr. T suddenly shivered. Why was this girl standing at his gate at this hour? Last night, she had appeared so strangely. Mr. T strained to open his eyes wider to get a clearer look. The girl was dressed in a white silk blouse and black pants, resembling attire from ancient times. Mr. T was alarmed. On such a chilly night, he himself was in a sweater, and yet she appeared so elegantly dressed. Who could she possibly be to be here at this hour? Could she be insane? Mr. T scratched his head in confusion, reaching up to unlatch the door bolt. And just as he touched the latch, suddenly, outside the gate, the girl lifted her head and looked at him with a chilling smile. "Hi." Mr. T's hair stood on end. Now he could finally see her face clearly. She seemed to be a 16, 17-year-old girl with a pale, icy complexion that strangely highlighted her delicate and striking features against the cold night. Mr. T hesitated, about to switch on the light inside the house when, "Please, open the door for me." Mr. T's muscles twitched. Suddenly, he felt as though he were being hypnotized. Her voice was gentle, cold, at times near, at times distant, yet strangely captivating. Mr. T stood frozen in place, stuttering as he replied, Who are you?" The girl smiled, her arms reaching through the gate gap, beckoning. "It's me. My house is just at the beginning of the alley. Don't you know me?" Mr. T trembled, surprised. He answered hesitantly, almost unconsciously, "Your house? There's no house at the beginning of the alley. Why do you look so strange to me? It's like I've never met you before. Why didn't you go home last night instead of standing at my gate?" The girl's voice carried a tone of reproach. "My house. You pass by it every day. Open the door. Come out and play with me. I like you so much, Mr. T." Her voice was oddly compelling, gentle yet chilling, as if it was pulling at Mr. T's heartstrings. Mr. T involuntarily smiled, nodded, and then reached up to pull the door latch with a click. Click! There was a click. The surrounding darkness enveloped the house, when suddenly a bright white flashlight illuminated the area. "Hey, what are you doing?" Mrs. L's voice echoed. Mr. T had his hand on the door and was startled. The unfamiliar girl was standing outside the gate, waving at him. Seeing the flashlight, she seemed annoyed. Without saying another word to him, she hastily turned and walked away. Mr. T was surprised, calling out hesitantly, Hey, you!" Mrs. B quickly walked over to Mr. T and slapped him hard on the shoulder. "Hey, who are you talking to? What are you doing out here at this hour?" As Mrs. L spoke, she looked outside. The courtyard was now just a blur of darkness. It was completely silent and there was no one around. Mr. T was now fully awake. He shook his head, rubbed his eyes in surprise, and turned to his wife. "Oh, where did she go? This girl who was just standing outside our gate." Mrs. L tilted her head, frowning as if she couldn't hear clearly. "What are you talking about? Which girl?" As she spoke, she glanced outside again. Mr. T stammered, trying to explain that there was a girl he had seen standing outside the gate earlier. Now, he saw her there again. "Come out and play." Mrs. L widened her eyes in surprise and said, "Are you crazy? What nonsense are you talking about? Who would be standing out there at this time of night? It's freezing like this. Are you dreaming, dear? Go to bed. Since evening, you've been talking nonsense." Mr. T scratched his head in confusion. He looked at his wife and then back outside at the spot where the strange girl had been standing. Indeed, there was no one there. Was it just a dream, a hallucination, or what? Mr. T stood there pondering, but couldn't come up with a satisfactory answer. Looking at the clock, Mrs. L realized it was nearly 3 a.m. She took Mr. T's hand and led him back into the bedroom, turning off the lights, and said, "Go to sleep. Stop with this nonsense. Out there. Maybe these days, while you're out selling, you saw a pretty girl and got drunk thinking about her, right? If you keep this up, you'll drive me crazy." With that, Mrs. L pulled Mr. T into the bedroom, closed the door, and went to sleep to get ready for an early morning market day. Outside in the courtyard, the space sank into silence and darkness again. Somewhere in the distance, only the sound of the wind and the faint barking of dogs echoed through the neighborhood. Bark, bark, bark. The next morning, Mr. T woke up, still unable to shake the image of the strange girl from his mind. Mrs. L cooked a bowl of instant noodles from under the stove for him. Seeing him sitting there absent-mindedly like a lost soul in the middle of the house, "Oh my, why do you look so distracted? Eat quickly so you can go to the market early. It's the weekend today, so it'll probably be crowded." After Mrs. L finished preparing breakfast for Mr. T, she went into the bedroom to wake up their two children. Mr. T finished his noodles, then headed out of the house on his bicycle, his mind still wandering. Occasionally, he heard faint whispers in his ears, indistinctly. "My house is right at the beginning of the alley. Don't you know me? You pass by my house every day." Mr. T furrowed his brow, deep in thought. Could there really be someone in this neighborhood he hadn't met yet? Walking around at night to tease people? Surely, that girl must have some issues. But she was... He had to admit she had a strangely compelling charm that had occupied his mind all night. Mr. T pondered for a while, sighed deeply, looked puzzled, and pedaled straight ahead. When he reached the alley entrance, however, he suddenly felt a prickling sensation, a shiver running down his spine. It seemed like someone was stealthily watching him. Mr. T stopped his bike, looking around. He checked the watch on his wrist and realized it was only 6 a.m. The village lane was deserted, seemingly everyone in the surrounding houses still asleep. Here and there, only the crowing of roosters echoed throughout the village, as if inviting the first rays of the morning sun. Mr. T stood and saw no one. He muttered to himself, "Strange," and then, still perplexed, continued on to the market. Behind him, the abandoned small tomb still lay under the bamboo grove, silently watching his figure as he departed. Throughout that day, he seemed lost in thought. He was selling, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Sometimes he gave customers the wrong change. Other times he delivered goods and then wandered into their homes, forgetting to collect payment. Mrs. L found his behavior perplexing and asked what was wrong, but Mr. T could only mumble incoherently, unable to articulate anything. He appeared as if he had just fallen from the sky. That afternoon, as usual, Mrs. L returned home early to bathe and look after their two children. Mr. T returned later. It was winter, and their small shop was doing very well. As dusk fell, the market closed, and vendors and customers alike began to head home. After a long day of trading, Mr. T pedaled his bike slowly towards Freedom Alley, feeling strangely disconnected. He felt like his mind and body weren't quite awake. He was in a half-dazed state, neither fully awake nor fully asleep. As Mr. T approached the entrance to their alley, passing by the unmarked grave, he suddenly felt a chill run through his limbs, a strange sensation creeping over his body. The wind picked up, breaking the stillness of the surroundings. Mr. T shivered slightly. Suddenly, his bicycle, which had been moving steadily, began